The chessboard is shifting beneath our feet, and most Americans have no idea what's actually happening in our own hemisphere. Right now, Russian warships are cutting through Caribbean waters toward Venezuela, not as some reckless provocation, but as a calculated statement that the old rules no longer apply. While Washington dispatches threats and economic sanctions like they're still operating in a unipolar world, Moscow and Caracas are writing a different script entirely. This isn't about ideology or good versus evil. It's about the architecture of global power being completely redrawn. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, yet faces crushing US sanctions designed to collapse its economy and install a compliant government. Russia's naval arrival isn't just military theater. It's a declaration that sovereign nations can forge their own alliances regardless of Washington's approval. The Monroe Doctrine, that 200-year-old American assertion of hemispheric dominance, is being openly challenged. What we're witnessing is the twilight of American hegemony and the emergence of a multipolar reality where raw power, resource control, and strategic partnerships matter far more than the liberal international order we've been told is permanent and inevitable. Let me be absolutely clear about what's unfolding here. Because the mainstream narrative you're getting fed through cable news and establishment media is designed to obscure rather than illuminate, when Russian naval vessels arrive in Venezuelan waters, the immediate reaction from Washington and its media apparatus is predictable. They frame it as aggression, as destabilization, as Putin's reckless expansionism threatening peace in our backyard. But step back from the emotional manipulation for just a moment and ask yourself a simple question. Who exactly is threatening whom here? Venezuela is a sovereign nation that has invited Russian ships into its territorial waters. This is entirely legal under international law, completely legitimate, and frankly none of Washington's business. Yet the outrage machine cranks into high gear because the fundamental assumption underlying American foreign policy for over a century is that Latin America belongs to us, that these nations exist in our sphere of influence, and that any outside power engaging with them represents an unacceptable challenge to our dominance. The hypocrisy is so thick you could cut it with a knife. The United States maintains over 800 military bases in more than 70 countries around the world. We have troops permanently stationed across Europe, throughout Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, and yes, throughout Latin America. We conduct naval operations in the South China Sea, thousands of miles from American shores, and call it freedom of navigation. We station missile defense systems in Poland and Romania, right on Russia's doorstep, and claim it's purely defensive. We overthrow governments we don't like, impose sanctions that starve civilian populations, and arm rebel groups to destabilize nations that refuse to subordinate their interests to ours. But when Russia parks a few ships in friendly Venezuelan ports, suddenly this represents an intolerable provocation that threatens regional stability. The double standard isn't just obvious, it's insulting to anyone paying attention. Let's talk about Venezuela itself, because understanding what's really happening there is crucial to grasping the broader geopolitical transformation underway. Venezuela has been under sustained American assault for years now, and I use that word deliberately because what we're witnessing isn't simply diplomatic disagreement or economic competition. It's a systematic campaign to destroy Venezuela's economy, immiserate its population, and create the conditions for regime change. The sanctions imposed by Washington are some of the most comprehensive and devastating in modern history. They've cut Venezuela off from international financial systems, prevented the country from selling its oil on global markets, frozen billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets held abroad, and made it nearly impossible for the Venezuelan government to import food, medicine, and other essential goods. The human cost has been catastrophic, with living standards collapsing and millions of Venezuelans fleeing the country. And here's what you need to understand. This suffering is not an accidental byproduct of American policy, it's the intended outcome. The explicit goal is to make life so unbearable for ordinary Venezuelans that they rise up and overthrow their government, installing a leadership more amenable to American interests. Now you might say, well, Venezuela is a dictatorship, Maduro is authoritarian, the government is corrupt and mismanages the economy, and sure, you can make critiques of Venezuela's governance. God knows every government on earth, including our own, deserves plenty of criticism. But let's not pretend that American hostility toward Venezuela has anything to do with promoting democracy or human rights. The United States supports some of the most repressive dictatorships on the planet when they align with our interests. Saudi Arabia, a medieval absolute monarchy that dismembers journalists and wages genocidal war in Yemen, is one of our closest allies. Egypt's military dictatorship receives billions in American aid. We backed the coup in Bolivia in 2019 precisely because the democratic government there wasn't sufficiently compliant with American corporate interests. The pattern is clear and consistent. Washington supports democracy only when democratic processes produce outcomes we approve of. When voters elect governments that prioritize their own national interests over American corporate access to their resources, suddenly democracy becomes negotiable. Venezuela's real crime, the thing that makes it an unforgivable threat in Washington's eyes, is that it sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves and refuses to hand them over to American and European corporations on terms favorable to those corporations under Hugo Chavez and continued under Maduro. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry and used the revenues to fund social programs for its population rather than enriching foreign shareholders. This is absolutely intolerable to the logic of neoliberal capitalism that has governed American foreign policy for decades. Resources in the global south are supposed to be available for extraction by Western corporations, with compliant local elites receiving their cut for facilitating the arrangement. When a government says no, when it asserts genuine sovereignty over its natural resources and uses them for domestic development rather than foreign profit, it must be punished, must be made an example of, so that other nations don't get similar ideas. This is where Russia's involvement becomes genuinely significant, because what Moscow is doing is providing Venezuela with an alternative. For decades, the American playbook has been straightforward: isolate targeted nations economically, cut them off from international markets and financial systems, strangle their economies, and wait for collapse. This works when the United States and its allies control access to global markets and there's no alternative power center nations can turn to, but that world is disappearing. Russia, along with China, is offering targeted nations a way to survive outside the American-dominated system. This isn't charity. Russia has its own interests, obviously, but it fundamentally changes the calculus. Venezuela can sell oil to Russia and China. It can access financing from non-Western sources. It can import goods and technology without going through channels controlled by Washington. The sanctions still hurt, still impose real costs, but they're no longer a death sentence. And this drives Washington absolutely mad because it reveals the declining nature of American power. We can no longer simply decree that a nation will be isolated and destroyed and have it happen automatically. The arrival of Russian naval forces in Venezuela is symbolic of this broader shift. It's not primarily about the military hardware itself. A few ships don't fundamentally alter the regional military balance. What it represents is Russia publicly demonstrating that Venezuela has a great power patron, that it's not isolated and vulnerable, that attempts to pressure or threaten it will have to account for Russian interests and capabilities. This is how international relations actually work in a multipolar world. Nations form alliances, they provide mutual support, they create relationships of mutual benefit and mutual defense. This is completely normal statecraft. But it's treated as scandalous when it happens outside American permission, because the underlying assumption of our foreign policy establishment is that only the United States should have the right to form alliances, station forces abroad, and protect its interests globally. Everyone else is supposed to operate within the American-designed and American-controlled international system, accepting subordinate status and limited sovereignty. Now let's zoom out even further. Because Venezuela and Russian ships are just one theater in a much larger transformation of the global order. What we're living through is the end of the unipolar moment, the collapse of the brief period following the Soviet Union's dissolution, when the United States stood as the sole superpower with uncontested global dominance. That moment is over, finished, and no amount of military spending or aggressive posturing is going to resurrect it. The rest of the world has watched American behavior over the past 2 decades, the disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the destruction of Libya, the attempt to do the same to Syria, the relentless expansion of NATO despite promises not to do so, the weaponization of the dollar and the international financial system, the arbitrary seizure of other nations' assets, the absolute disregard for international law whenever it constrains American action, and they've drawn the obvious conclusion: you cannot trust the United States, you cannot rely on American goodwill, and you must build alternatives to American-dominated systems or remain perpetually vulnerable to American coercion. This is what the BRICS expansion is about, what the development of alternative payment systems, independent of SWIFT, is about, what the increasing bilateral trade in national currencies rather than dollars is about, what the Belt and Road Initiative is about, and yes, what Russian warships in Venezuelan waters are about. These are all pieces of a massive restructuring of global power relationships, and here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't happening because Russia and China are uniquely evil or aggressive. It's happening because the United States has systematically abused its dominant position to the point where other major powers have concluded they have no choice but to build alternative structures. When you weaponize every system, financial, technological, informational, to punish anyone who disagrees with you, you incentivize the construction of parallel systems outside your control. The tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. The United States emerged from the Cold War with unprecedented goodwill, enormous economic advantages, and the opportunity to build a genuinely cooperative international order based on mutual benefit and respect for sovereignty. We could have used our dominance to create systems that were fair, that gave other nations a genuine stake in stability and prosperity, that respected different political and economic models. Instead, we pursued what can only be described as imperial overreach, treating the rest of the world as a collection of resource pools and consumer markets to be controlled and exploited. We expanded NATO eastward despite Russian objections and despite the fact that this served no defensive purpose. We invaded Iraq on fabricated pretenses, destroying a country and destabilizing an entire region. We overthrew the Libyan government, turning North Africa's most prosperous nation into a failed state with open slave markets. We armed radical jihadists in Syria to overthrow another government we didn't like. We imposed sanctions on a third of the world's population. And all the while, we lectured everyone else about rules and norms and values, even as we systematically violated every principle we claimed to uphold whenever it suited our interests. The consequences of this approach are now unavoidable. The dollar's status as the global reserve currency, which has given the United States enormous economic advantages and the ability to run perpetual trade deficits while exporting inflation, is being gradually undermined. More and more international trade is being conducted in other currencies. Central banks are diversifying away from dollar reserves. The petrodollar system that has been a cornerstone of American financial dominance since the 1970s is eroding as major oil producers accept payment in yuan and other currencies. None of this happens overnight. These are long-term structural shifts, but the direction is clear and probably irreversible at this point. And as the dollar loses its privileged position, the United States will face real economic constraints for the first time in generations. We'll have to actually pay for our imports with exports, balance our budgets without being able to print the world's reserve currency, and compete on more equal terms with other economies. This will be painful and will require massive adjustments to our economy and society. Militarily too, the landscape is changing in ways that Washington seems reluctant to acknowledge. American weapon systems that were once unquestionably superior are being matched or surpassed by Russian and Chinese developments. Hypersonic missiles, sophisticated air defense systems, electronic warfare capabilities, cyber warfare tools. The technological edge the United States has relied on is narrowing. Moreover, the sheer geographic challenge of projecting power globally, when potential adversaries can focus their resources regionally, is becoming apparent. Russia, defending its immediate periphery, has enormous advantages over the United States, trying to project power there from halfway around the world. China in the South China Sea operates with interior lines and local superiority that would make any American military intervention extremely costly and risky. The era when the United States could casually bomb any country it wanted with minimal risk is ending, and the defense establishment hasn't fully grappled with what this means for American strategy. What makes all of this particularly dangerous is the disconnect between reality and perception in Washington's foreign policy establishment. If you read the strategy documents, listen to the think tank discussions, follow the congressional hearings, you'd think we're still living in 1995, that American dominance is eternal and unchallengeable, that the rest of the world has no choice but to accept our leadership. There's a fundamental refusal to acknowledge changed circumstances, to recognize legitimate interests of other major powers, to pursue genuine diplomacy and compromise. Instead, every challenge is met with escalation, every setback is blamed on insufficient resolve, and every proposal for restraint or accommodation is denounced as weakness and appeasement. This mindset is extraordinarily dangerous when you're actually in relative decline, because it leads to policies that accelerate your decline while increasing the risk of catastrophic miscalculation and confrontation. Venezuela is a perfect example of this dynamic. A rational, clear-eyed assessment would recognize that Venezuela is going to chart its own course, that we don't have the ability to simply install a puppet government there without massive military intervention that would be politically impossible and strategically insane, and that our best option is to normalize relations, engage diplomatically, and compete economically with Russia and China for influence through actual benefits we can offer rather than threats we can make. But that's not how Washington thinks. Instead, we double down on failed sanctions, continue to recognize a random guy who declared himself president years ago as the legitimate leader despite his having no actual power or popular support, and treat any nation that helps Venezuela survive as an enemy to be confronted. This isn't strategy, it's ideological rigidity masquerading as toughness. And this brings us back to those Russian ships because they're forcing a moment of truth. What exactly is the United States prepared to do about Russian military cooperation with Venezuela? Are we going to impose more sanctions on Russia, as if the existing sanctions haven't already pushed Russia completely out of the Western economic sphere and into deeper partnership with China? Are we going to threaten Venezuela with military action, risking direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed power over a country that poses zero threat to American security? Are we going to stage another coup attempt, even though previous attempts have failed, and would now have to contend with Venezuelan forces backed by Russian intelligence and possibly Russian military support? Or are we going to finally acknowledge that we can't control everything, that other nations have the right to form relationships we don't approve of, and that attempting to maintain global hegemony is bankrupting us economically and morally while making the world more dangerous for everyone, including Americans? The sensible course is obvious, but it requires abandoning assumptions that are deeply embedded in how America's foreign policy establishment thinks about the world. It requires accepting that we're one major power among several, not the indispensable nation that gets to make rules for everyone else. It requires recognizing that security in the 21st century comes from cooperation and mutual respect, not dominance and coercion. It requires understanding that other countries pursuing their own interests isn't aggression against us. It's normal international behavior that we engage in constantly ourselves, and it requires admitting that many of our recent interventions have been disasters that have harmed American interests while causing immense suffering abroad, and that we need a fundamentally different approach. The establishment of a multipolar world order, which is what we're witnessing, doesn't have to mean chaos or constant conflict. Multiple great powers have coexisted throughout most of human history, managing their relationships through diplomacy, balance of power arrangements, and occasional limited confrontations that don't escalate to total war. It's actually the pursuit of total dominance by one power that tends to produce the most devastating conflicts, as other powers eventually resist and alliances form to balance against the would-be hegemon. A world where the United States, Russia, China, India, and regional powers in other areas each have their own spheres of influence and negotiate their differences through actual diplomacy could be more stable and peaceful than the current system where Washington tries to control everything and treats any challenge as an existential threat. But getting from here to there requires wisdom and restraint that's been largely absent from American statecraft for decades. It requires leaders who can explain to the American people that we can have a prosperous, secure, and free country without dominating the entire planet, that the costs of empire vastly exceed any benefits, and that the resources we're pouring into military interventions and global power projection could be invested in rebuilding our own infrastructure, education, healthcare, and communities. It requires a foreign policy establishment that prioritizes American well-being over the maintenance of global control, that can distinguish between genuine security threats and wounded pride when other nations don't follow our dictates. Russian ships in Venezuelan waters are a small piece of this larger puzzle, a symbol of changing times. They represent something that should have been obvious all along, that Venezuela is a sovereign nation with the right to form alliances and accept assistance from whomever it chooses, just as the United States does. They demonstrate that the unipolar moment has ended and that other powers will act in their own interests regardless of American preferences. And they pose a question to American policymakers and to the American people. Are we going to adapt to this new reality with wisdom and pragmatism, Or are we going to keep pretending we're living in a world that no longer exists until reality forces even more painful adjustments upon us? The answer to that question will determine not just what happens in Venezuela, but the shape of the entire 21st century global order and America's place within it.